will always go. These are the places I will always go. So I wish I was a slave to an age-old trade. Lord, have mercy on my rough and rowdy ways. These are the places I will always go. Honeybee, can you imagine where our lives would lead? That silly ring, it wasn't meant to be. Luckily I saw in me something I couldn't see. I wish I was a slave to honeybee. I can't imagine how my life would be if all your gravity did not hit me. Oh, don't you see, darling, my honeybee. But here we are, after all the misses and confessions to the stars that we never really owned his eyes. And if I woke up stumbling down, I never could forgive myself for leaving out. Luckily you saw me, you are the only. I wish I was a slave. Such a fool. I took you out and out another room. You took your bed and didn't let it show. Stuck around to let me know. Built the family of our own. So many reasons I would fight to stay. You're the courage when I fade. Take a look at what we've made. After all the misses and confessions to the scars, we never really realized. And if I would come stumbling down, I never could forgive myself for leaving out. You are the only. Won't you decide? Won't you decide? I want you to decide. let's be still. Just for a moment, let's be still. The world's just spinning. Just for a moment, let's just stand. If things don't slow down, just for a moment, let's be still. The world's not perfect. Just for a moment, let's be still. The days turn into months, the nights turn into days. So just for a moment, let's be still. Just for a moment, let's be still. The world's just spinning. Just for a moment, let's just stand. If things don't slow down, just for a moment, let's be still. The world's not perfect. Just for a moment, tell me something, baby. Hope for the night. You don't know how we're just praying that we're doing this right. That's not the way it seems. Summer gone, now winter's on its way. I will miss the days we had. I will miss the tell me something, baby. Hope for the night. You don't know how we're just praying that we're doing this right. That's not the way it seems. Summer gone, now winter's on its way. I will miss the days we had. I will miss the tell me something, baby. Hope for the night. You don't know how we're just praying that we're doing this right. That's not the way it seems. Summer gone, now winter's on its way. I will miss the days we had. Days we had, days we had. Oh, I miss the days we had.
I've been leaving, it's too late for this now. Such a scene for each hand's gone. Has time driven our season away? Cause that's the way it seems. In the wild of this beach that is new, I'll be back again to stay. Again to stay. I'll be back again to stay. Again to stay.
my pen ran dry long before your smile. And the pages have always been blank like the trees in the wild. But the wind, yes, the wind keeps pushing you to leave. Time being time, I know when it's time to leave. And the memories we've made will never be lost, no. And the look on your face, we both knew the cost. But the wind, yes, the wind keeps out.
Okay.
That would have been much better, wouldn't it? I'm telling you. You weren't thinking. Although, Marcella, I think there's some at the back.
Et voilà. Okay. Welcome everybody to our first town hall meeting. And I would like to thank everybody on Zoom and on YouTube who are watching this virtually. And I'd like to thank Cam Roxborough, our other moderator. My name is Carol Ann Flanagan, and I'm the ED of the Society to End Homelessness. We'd like to introduce our candidates this evening, and I was going to do this alphabetically. So we'll start with Maureen Curran from the Green Party of Canada, Terry Beech from the Liberal Party is running late. From the New Democratic Party of Canada, Peter Julian. And from the People's Party of Canada, Marcella Williams. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And so, Cam.
Let me just add my welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We're really glad to host not only the event, but to host you guys and all that you do for our country. So thank you so much for that. Caroline and I were talking about how do we kick this off? And I had a bit of a brainstorm. So let me try it. There's a Hebrew word called shalom. We use it sometimes in English. We've sort of co-opted it. But the word itself carries with it a sense of peace and flourishing. So we talk about shalom in a neighborhood, shalom in a community. And we're talking about this idea of flourishing neighborhoods. So our aim tonight is really to get at some of this. What does shalom look like in the midst of a neighborhood? So I'm going to invite you, and Caroline, I don't know the order here we're going to do, but you get 1 minute, and it's kind of off the top of your heads. What does a flourishing neighborhood look like? What does it look like when shalom moves into a neighborhood? All right? What's a flourishing neighborhood look like?
Flourishing neighborhood and peace. I like that. It's when community comes together and the people work together in unity and addressing the needs that each one has. I believe that we can all work together. We can hear one another out. We can care for our communities. And peace is knowing that we are working together and helping one another, because when we help one another, we're helping ourselves as well. And that takes away from our worries and our strife. And I believe that just brings peace to mind and to heart. Thank you.
Hello. Well, when I think of shalom and peace, I think of my own communities and the places that I have loved to live and the places where I knew I felt at home. When I was growing up in Toronto, the area that I lived there, even when I go back after years and years, I smell the smell and I know that I'm in a place where people care about me. When my mom had Alzheimer's and would wander away. That community was a place where neighbors would find her, take care of her, make sure she got home safely. We want that for absolute everyone. We want everyone to be safe, no matter what their situation in life. We want communities where we can care about each other, where we have that room and that space to really reach out and take each other into our hearts.
Shalom, peace. What does that mean for this neighborhood? Well, it should mean everybody having a roof over their head at night, not having to worry about where they're going to sleep. Whether they're going to sleep down at the Edmund SkyTrain station or sleep in one of the parks. No, they'll be sleeping in their own bed, in their own home. Peace means not having to worry about whether or not the medication that is absolutely essential to keep yourself alive is something you can pay for or not. Peace means no food insecurity, not having to line up in a food bank to make ends meet, but rather actually having, with a guaranteed livable basic income, the ability to put food on your table. Peace means no racism. Peace means a government and governments at all levels that step up together to ensure that everybody in the community has peace and peace of mind.
One aspect of a flourishing neighborhood is the idea that every person would be dignified with a place to live. There would be very little or no homelessness. Clearly, it is not the case at present. So we want to ask a few questions on the topic of dealing with our current crisis of those without a place to live. For some who face a high risk of being without a place to live. Cam?
All right, Carol Ann. And who gets to go first on this one? Peter, you're back. We're making you come back right away. So I'm going to ask 3 questions.
And how much time?
You get a minute on each of these questions, but your first one was 59.5 seconds. So it was perfect. It was right on track. Okay. So here's the first one. We're dealing with the issue of homelessness. First question is, what strategies does your party have for dealing with the current situation around homelessness, particularly, of course, here in Burnaby? Please comment on some of the specifics of how these strategies would help those dealing specifically with racial or cultural barriers as well.
We're not talking about strategies. We're talking about a sea change in how we approach the issue of homelessness in this country. I can remember growing up when we wouldn't find people having to sleep in parks or sleeping in doorways across the length and breadth of our country. But we know that this year, about 250,000 Canadians will experience homelessness at some point or another. And I went through that myself. So I feel very keenly what the impacts of the existing lack of any sort of strategy entails. What we need to do is get back to doing what we did after the Second World War, and that is build housing for everyone, ensure that everybody has a roof over their head at night. And that means 500,000 homes need to be built as quickly as possible. We've already done it. After the Second World War, we built 300,000 homes in 3 years. We can do that again.
Let me follow on. So what resources would your party commit to offering municipalities and other local organizations who are seeking to, in your words, build these 500,000 homes? And they would help currently those who are homeless or at risk of being homeless. Do you see a need for new funding or just a continuation of the ongoing funds?
No, absolutely not. We need dramatic new increases in funding, which is why the NDP has called for a wealth tax, a pandemic profits tax, because the ultra rich in this country have gotten away with far too much for far too long. We need a fair tax system to start. But the reality is, if we look to where we were a few decades ago, before the National Housing Program was eliminated by the former Paul Martin Liberal government, we had in place funding agreements with cooperative housing, with the nonprofit organizations, with social housing, with municipalities. We need to get back to that The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation provided $150 billion in liquidity supports just this year to the banks to maintain bank profits. A fraction of that provided through the CMHC would ensure every nonprofit, every co-op, every municipality could have the wherewithal to actually build affordable housing and partner to ensure that everybody has a roof over their head at night. That's where we get the 500,000 affordable homes from.
Thank you. Excellent. Let me just tweak it a little bit. So we saw this summer unbelievable heat waves, right? And there's a great need for caring for the vulnerable, the homeless, in those hot weather, cold weather situations. What resources would you guys commit to helping, again, municipalities or local organizations to deal with extreme weather response centers?
Well, resources are needed immediately, but that's a small fraction of what's required to actually put in place the right to housing in this country. So we would be working with nonprofits and municipalities across the country to ensure that we have in place cold weather and hot weather shelters across the country. But that's only a transition strategy. That's only something that would hopefully last a very short period of time. What we need to do is make sure we have affordable housing for everybody in this country. It's something that other countries are able to do. Canada should be able to as well. That $150 billion bailout package of the banks, actually it was part of a $750 billion support package for Canada's banks to maintain profits during the COVID pandemic. We need to use a small portion of what was massively handed over to the banks to make sure everyone has a roof over their head at night. That's a principle. We brought it to the House of Commons. Liberals and Conservatives voted against it. The NDP will keep fighting for it because it's the right thing to do.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to get good at these questions by the time I've asked them a number of times. So let me go through them again and one at a time. So it's sort of, we keep it straight. So what strategies does your party have for dealing with the current situation around homelessness, particularly here in Burnaby? Comment specifically on some specifics around strategies that would help dealing with those who are dealing with racial or cultural barriers.
Thank you. Well, I'm a First Nation lady, and I've faced those barriers myself. We believe in fairness and fairness for everybody. So, just get to the right answer here. Our party's response to homelessness issues would be inclusive and fair to all people so that citizens feel respected and safe. These troubles that we are in are a macro sense caused by governments interfering in the marketplace, and money ordinarily that would be going to these issues and services has been misappropriated, and the debt has skyrocketed. This contributes to a lot of the problems that we are having, and we feel the need to cut taxes so that people would be able to have the resources in order to help at their local areas, so help them within their own communities.
Thanks. Okay, let me follow up with that. So we talked about strategies. What about resources? So what resources would your party commit to offering both municipalities and other local organizations who are seeking to support those who are currently homeless or at risk of being homeless? Do you see a need for new funding or just the continuation of ongoing funds?
So we feel at this time a continuation of current funding. We would not do any cuts to any of the funding that is currently available. We also feel that there is an opportunity for the community to come together and work on solutions that they feel would suit their neighborhoods and this city as a whole, and taking personal responsibility for community rather than waiting on Ottawa to fix the problem. This is a solution that we feel can be helped by every citizen within the city.
Okay, so thirdly, we're on resources again. And as we talked about just a few minutes ago with Peter, we saw incredible heat waves this summer. And it was just so obvious the need for extreme weather shelters. So what would you guys do in terms of resources, not just in the hot, but also in the cold, for helping those that are in these crisis situations during extreme weathers? What would you do resource-wise for that?
Resource-wise, okay, well, for the federal government to expand its services for temporary or emergency measures would require monies that need to be obtained through taxes, which means gathering, and or borrowed money in order to reduce the ability on any future government to respond to an emergency situation. We would support and enable local governments to respond to these issues.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. While we're waiting just for a second, I just want to comment to those that are on Zoom or on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to send in some questions. We're taking questions. We're queuing them up for a little bit later when we get to that part of the evening. Third
time lucky.
Third time. Here we go. All right. You probably don't even need me to read the questions anymore, but I'll do it just out of courtesy. You ready?
Just to keep it rolling. Yeah.
What strategies does your party have for dealing with the current situation around homelessness, particularly here in Burnaby? Please comment also on specifics of how these strategies would help those dealing with racial or cultural barriers.
Well, we recognize that there's a variety of reasons that people end up homeless. And so any successful strategies have to be just as complex as the problems that we want to solve. The Green Party was actually the first party to put forth the idea of a guaranteed livable income or universal basic income. And it continues to be a key part of our strategy to help reduce the number of people who are forced into homelessness in the first place. We also want to expand healthcare and include pharmacare and the mental health services that can provide the necessary ingredients to assist in the transition off of the street and maintain the scaffolding that each individual needs to stay that way. No plan is complete without addressing systemic racism and the long-term damage that generations of colonial policies have done. And so my job is to support the work that's being done locally to foster partnerships and join together to remove legislative and other systemic barriers that, like those that prevent Indigenous organizations from accessing government funding for housing projects. Thank you.
All right. No, don't run away. I got more. I'm not going to let you off that easy.
I'm new at this. I get
so we're moving.
being finished.
We're moving from strategies now to resources.
Exactly.
And I sit on the board of the Society to End Homelessness in Burnaby. So I'm interested in this one. And I know that our municipal governments are interested in this too. So let me ask it this way. What resources would your party put towards helping local municipalities, local governments, local organizations like the Society and others? How would you help us resource the very situation we're talking about? And would that look like more funds or the continuation of ongoing funds?
Well, I have to say that in the over 30 years that I've been a voter, I've heard lots of people promise to end homelessness and tackle it, but no one who's been in government in that time has actually put the money where the mouth is. We absolutely need more funding to help with this. And yes, there needs to be the preventative things like the UBI and more housing, health services, but also in the meantime, we need those interim measures and we need more shelters. We need a variety of shelters. When I talk to people like you who work with homeless people, we know that there's a variety of needs. There isn't just one type of homeless person. And so zero barrier shelters are essential for people who have pets and addictions that they can't leave at the door, and they have to have that kind of shelter. But there's other people who with maybe with children, young teenagers, they need a more supportive and secure place where they can go and be comfortable. So we need a variety of shelters in various places around the town until we can get the housing in place so that they don't, are no longer homeless.
I knew this would happen. I have a feeling that you've already answered question 3 as well, but let me ask it just in case you've got something else to add. So how would you resource local municipalities, local organizations, particularly as it comes to extreme weather shelters?
So with the climate crisis, extreme weather relief, unfortunately, is going to be an ongoing need. And we just can't count on that heat dome never happening again. We know that we need to be in better shape to deal with the next one, so we don't have the same tragic consequences. That means, yes, we need to have secure and consistent funding And we also need to make sure communities know where and how to find those shelters, so they have to be there all the time. And we also need equipped shelters and supportive housing with adequate systems to manage 40+ degree weather. Finally, we need to make sure that we're not dealing with these as short-term events. We need comprehensive ways to increase support to vulnerable communities, like increasing support to seniors, whether they're in their homes or whether they're in properly maintained long-term care or supportive facilities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's great. Terry, welcome. Glad you're here. It's a very busy time. We know that, we get that, but you snuck in just under the wire, and we've got time for you for this first set of questions on homelessness as well. Can I invite you to the mic?
Apologies, I was meeting with local First Nation, but I got here as soon as I could.
All good. I think I've asked the questions enough that I can probably do this off the top of my head now. So here's the deal. What strategies would the Liberals put in place to deal with the issue of either those that are struggling with homelessness or those that are at risk with homelessness, and particularly maybe those that are facing racial and cultural barriers?
So first of all, thank you to the Society for Ending Homelessness for hosting this. This is fantastic. Thank you to the church for putting this together. We recognize that it's important for all of us to invest in the entirety of the housing continuum. Since 2015, we have tripled the federal investment in ending homelessness, $2.2 billion in support. We've set a target of reducing chronic homelessness by 50% by 2027, and that includes ending homelessness for veterans by 2025. We invested over $1.89 billion in the homelessness partnering strategy and reaching home for 2016 to 2021. And we've increased our toolkit by expanding the national housing strategy to more than $72 billion and prioritizing investments in mental health.
All right. So we've started in on the strategy part, and you gave us a whole bunch of figures around what you've done. So let me go to this next question, which is really, how would you continue to resource local organizations, local municipal governments, or would you be able to even increase the resourcing that you guys have done already as a way to help move this problem?
So we are increasing our ambition to end chronic homelessness, and to accomplish that, we will need new resources. To answer your first question, your most obvious question. Just this year in budget 2021, we invested $567 million in new funding for Reaching Home, which more than doubled the existing funding for the program, and frankly has been a lifesaver during a perilous time for vulnerable individuals in our community. The program is successful because it works well with the municipal and Indigenous governments as well as local organizations. And we've also been rolling out the $72 billion national housing strategy. We've recognized that we need to put essential infrastructure in place, which is why we added $1.5 billion to the Rapid Housing Initiative and invested more than $5 billion through the province in mental health. And in fact, we are dedicated to ensuring that $2.5 billion a year is provided for mental health services from here on out.
Thanks for that. Let me tweak it just a tiny bit. So we're still on the topic of homelessness, but I want to just ask around the conversation of extreme weather shelters. We saw this summer the incredible heat wave. We've been through winters where we've had sub-zero temperatures and people sleeping on the street. So what resources could we look for as we go forward, local municipalities and local organizations from your government? What resources could we hope for, look for as we move ahead?
Well, the National Housing Strategy is the most flexible housing strategy that government Canada has ever had. In fact, it's one of the biggest things that we've done since the federal government wasn't really dramatically in housing over the last 30 years. But I'm very happy to see the change of how we're dealing with this issue, especially with our new mayor in Burnaby, which opens up a lot of opportunities for us. Since 2015, our government has created or repaired more than 7,000 shelter spaces. We invested $500 million in emergency funding to maintain services and prevent homelessness during the pandemic. And the National Housing Strategy, like I said previously, is super flexible. So to fill those needs of unique municipalities, the needs here in Burnaby are different than Saskatchewan, different than Atlantic Canada. So we can customize those to individual community needs. And while emergency shelters provide critical short-term emergency support, we know the important role of transitional housing as well. And just on the Indigenous side, we've invested $420 million to construct 38 Indigenous-led emergency shelters and 50 Indigenous-led transition homes since we took office.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
So I just want to make this comment. And so we finished round one. We've got 3 rounds of this before we do a little bit of question and answer. And I think all the candidates did a remarkable job of keeping to the 1 minute. A little bit over on a couple, a little bit under on another couple, but we averaged it out. It was pretty good. Now, some of us are old enough to remember the show, The Gong Show. There's a big hook that will come in through the window. If you go over a minute in round 2, a hook's going to grab you and take you off. All right. So let me preamble question number 2 or category number 2. Let's go a step further. Part of creating a flourishing neighborhood, this shalom that we've talked about, resolving issues of homelessness, is solving the issue of affordable housing. Here in the Lower Mainland, we all know escalating housing prices. This is a crucial issue. Here are a few questions to help us to think through how each party sees this side of the housing coin.
Yes, Maureen, you start. What strategy does your party have to address the issue of affordable housing? And what is the timeline to implement some of these steps?
Okay, so even before the pandemic, we know that there's 1.5 million Canadians that were living in inadequate or unaffordable housing. So we think it's time to face facts and actually declare a housing emergency. And we have a comprehensive list of strategies. I don't have time to get into all of them, so I'm going to highlight a couple. One of them is that we want to immediately establish a Minister of Housing that's going to manage and coordinate with provinces. We all want to update financing mechanisms and widen the criteria of what's eligible to get funding so that it will flow more effectively. And we want to restore those tax incentives for rental bills and give tax credits for those people donating land or property to community land trusts so that we can, get those affordable housing built. We also want to change that legislation that prevents Indigenous organizations from accessing those financing and allocating funding for urban Indigenous housing providers. We also want to support renters, providing a moratorium on evictions, and creating national health standards, standards for rent and vacancy controls. These are just a few.
Thank you. Now that we've looked at strategy, what resources would you put toward helping municipalities and local service providers for the construction of affordable housing, subsidized housing, co-ops, etc.? And what would you do to ensure individuals, families, people with disabilities, seniors that have an opportunity to stay in Burnaby in adequate housing?
So Green Party truly believes that housing is a human right. We want to make sure that funding gets where it's needed and quickly. I've actually seen how municipalities often have the land put aside. They've done all the groundwork with zoning permits, but then they've had housing projects that languish for years because they're lacking the funding. So I promise to make sure that that gap gets filled and quickly to turn that tide and actually stop us from falling further behind. This is why we want to expand the Rapid Housing Initiative and bring new projects on stream without delay. In the next 10 years, we want to invest in construction and operation of 50,000 supportive housing units and 300,000 affordable non-market co-op and nonprofit housing. Any project that's receiving federal funding should have 30% of its units dedicated to being deeply affordable or to be supportive housing. These are just a few of the ways that we want to invest in nonprofit housing with special attention provided to making sure there's adequate living spaces for seniors and those with disabilities.
Thank you. Now, my third question has an A and B to it. So I'll just ramble right through both. Okay. So Burnaby has a high rate of new immigrants, and particularly many who have come to Canada as with refugee status. In light of this, how would you ensure care for these new Canadians, and how would you encourage developers to build affordable housing units? And after we have seen the increase in affordable housing units to meet the current needs, what strategy would you have to ensure housing is sustained for our people who face these many challenges and barriers?
Thanks very much. My mom actually spent many years working with newly arrived refugees when I was a teenager, and I was inspired by meeting them and seeing their determination. I truly think it's essential to facilitate their putting down roots because we know that they're such a huge part of this country's success. And that anytime we support these new communities, they continue to pay it forward and support each other. So we want to make sure that we provide good housing in communities like Burnaby, where there's access to the services that they're going to need. And it's why we're making such a priority facilitating integrated housing that ensures equity and diversity, which is crucial to a thriving neighborhood. To do this right, the people that you see here are the ones that we need to get involved. Local control with full stakeholder participation is key to making sure that adequate housing is sustained. And it's through working with community organizations like this one, bringing us here tonight, that we can best assess local needs and make sure that equity issues are addressed.
I believe it is. I think Peter's next. Just check my list. I believe it's Peter next. It's okay. Is it me? It's good. You're all good. Yes. I'm skipping around here. Okay. Hello.
Hi.
So again, what strategy does your party have to address the issue of affordable housing? And what is the timeline to implement some of these steps?
Well, the PPC party has an affordable housing plan that involves more than just the housing market, but it would weave immigration into policy into a solution that would help Canadians and those immigrating to Canada. It's not a quick fix. It's not a short term. It would be a long-term solution that would require planning and analyzing what the situation is and what the needs are. And we would start there.
So what resources would you put towards helping municipalities and local service providers for the construction of affordable housing, subsidized housing, co-ops, etc.? And what would you do to ensure that individuals, families, people with disabilities, and seniors have the opportunity to stay in Burnaby in adequate housing?
The PPC party would hold provincial and municipal governments accountable to ensure results-oriented programs are implemented and housing units are built, and ensuring that bureaucratic red tape at the local level would be removed for private business builders so that they are able to increase the housing supply, therefore having more housing available and lowering the cost of housing substantially. Let's slow that down.
Okay, and so again, my question 3 has an A and B portion to it. I'll just do the whole thing. So Burnaby has a high rate of new immigrants, particularly many who have come to Canada as refugee status. In light of this, how would you ensure care for these new Canadians? And how would you encourage developers to build affordable housing units? And after we have seen the increase in affordable housing units to meet the current needs, what strategy would you have to ensure that housing is sustained for our people who face these many challenges and barriers?
Thank you. The first part, A, there is much money built into the price of building a single unit. By removing the red tape, permit costs, taxes, and timelines, so builders can provide increased housing supply in a shorter time and lower prices, means an overall increased affordability and availability. And part B, we would respect the provincial and municipal governments and give them the responsibility to be accountable to their jurisdictions in order to respond to the housing, sorry, I'm missing the last words, housing in their area. I'm sorry, I'm missing the last words on here. I can't see them. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, like him, I'm getting to know these questions by heart. Okay, so Peter, question one. What strategy does your party have to address the issue of affordable housing? And what is the timeline to implement some of these steps?
Well, I want to start off by saying, and Mr. Beech and I will disagree on this point. I asked an order paper question at the end of the first majority government. Liberals have been in power 4 years. How many new affordable housing units have been built with federal government funding across the country? The order paper response was 14,000. 14,000 at a time when over 4 years, there were over 200,000 new units that were needed. So we have fallen remarkably short on what is needed to handle the size and scope of the homelessness crisis. And we know homelessness is worse now than it was 6 years ago. We know now that the lines at the food bank for people who are trying to make ends meet are longer than they ever were. And so what we need to do is act immediately. That is our strategy, an immediate push to start working with municipalities, nonprofits, and the co-op housing sector to make sure that we have affordable housing for everybody, and the right to housing is acquired for all Canadians within a few years.
Thank you. And the next question is, what resources would you put towards helping municipalities and local service providers for the construction of affordable housing, subsidized housing, co-ops, that would ensure individuals, families, people with disabilities, and seniors have an opportunity to stay in Burnaby with adequate housing?
Yeah, that's a very good point that you raised. And I mentioned earlier the $750 billion liquidity support package for Canada's banks, including $150 billion from the CMHC, which is supposed to be guaranteeing housing for all Canadians. That went from the Trudeau government to the banks, not to provide affordable housing in this country. And so those resources and that fund from the CMHC needs to be allocated in a way that we did before with co-op housing and nonprofit housing in municipalities, as essentially funding that allows for the construction of those units. Jagmeet Singh has also said we will set aside federal lands to make sure that we have space available for the hundreds of thousands of new affordable housing units that we need across the country. So we are going to do this by mobilizing the resources of the federal government, not to support the banks and liquidity supports, but rather to make sure every Canadian has a roof over their head at night. That should be a right of all Canadians.
And our third question again is an A and B question, and I'll just go right through it. So Burnaby does have a high rate of new immigrants, particularly many who have come to Canada with refugee status. In light of this, how would you ensure care for these new Canadians? And how would you encourage developers to build affordable housing units? And the B part is, after we have seen an increase of affordable housing units to meet the current needs, what strategy would you have to ensure that housing is sustained for our people who face many challenges and barriers?
Thank you very much. And so first off, though we have some incentives for developers, the NDP's approach is to, like we did after the Second World War, actually build. The federal government has a responsibility to build affordable housing units, working in cooperation with co-ops, with nonprofits, with municipalities. So rather than offering incentives to developers, though that is part of our platform, it is above all ensuring that the financing is in place so that we can build the affordable housing units that we need across the country. Now, how do we sustain that? Well, first off, as we know with the cooperative housing sector and with nonprofits, the rent is not more than 30% of a person's income. That automatically provides supports for people that are struggling to make ends meet and to keep a roof over their head. And we would as well provide that ongoing sustaining funding that allows these housing units once built to continue to operate. It's what we used to do before the Paul Martin Liberal government slashed and eliminated the National Housing Program, and we can do it again in Canada. Thank you.
Terry, hi. You probably know these questions as well as I do now.
But I like hearing it.
That's up to you.
It's okay. So first question is, what strategy does your party have to address the issue of affordable housing? And what is the timeline to implement such some of these steps?
So the very first thing that's important to understand is that the federal government has been out of the housing game in a big way for 30 years. 11 of those years, Peter was elected. It shows the importance of, yes, we need progressive people in politics, and Peter does a great service, but we actually need progressive governments to get stuff delivered. When our government got elected in 2015, we had a massive infrastructure deficit that had been incurred over those 30 years. And we built a $72 billion housing strategy to address it. Not just that, we built the infrastructure around housing, sky trains, stormwater, sewage systems, so that we could have more regional nodes, so we had the locations to be able to build this higher density. Our platform focuses on three things: build more supply, 1.4 million homes in the next 4 years; taper demand, primarily by disincentivizing the financialization of housing and getting rid of it as an investment asset and focusing on it as a place to live where people can live near where they work; and finally, to provide a viable path to homeownership so renters can start building equity. We have a 30-point plan. It's on liberal.ca/housing. Thank you.
And our second question, what resources would you put towards helping municipalities and local service providers for the construction of affordable housing, subsidized housing, co-ops, etc., and that would ensure individuals, families, people with disabilities, seniors have an opportunity to stay in Burnaby in adequate housing?
In British Columbia, we've invested billions, and I'm not surprised that Peter took the 4-year number because it takes a while to build housing. But in Burnaby, that's included rapid housing money, that's included new affordable apartments, co-investment funding, and co-op units. We have 7 projects with the city of Burnaby that will create thousands of units. These would be under construction right now, but they were unfortunately turned down by the provincial government. So we're going to fund them directly from CMHC, working directly with the municipal government instead. But what's really exciting, what really fixes this issue, is that the housing strategy is designed to be permanent, which means cities can include federally funded affordable units in literally every tower they build from here on out. That is how we are going to really catch up on our infrastructure deficit and solve affordability in this community.
Our third question, part A and B all together. Burnaby has a high rate of new immigrants, particularly many of who have come to Canada with a refugee status. In light of this, how would you ensure care for these new Canadians? And how would you encourage developers to build affordable housing units? Part B is, after we have seen the increase in affordable housing units to meet the current levels, what strategy would you have to ensure that housing is sustained for our people who face these many challenges and barriers?
So Canada continues to attract the best and brightest immigrants from around the world. That's a huge advantage for Canada. At the same time, we've provided a pathway to safety for some of the world's most vulnerable. In fact, in 2019, we resettled more refugees than any other country. We should be proud of that. Just last week, I was at the Armenian church, where I got to catch up with Syrian refugees that first came here 5 years ago. I got to hear about their jobs, meet their children, and many of them are now Canadians, and many of them own their own homes. We've invested in organizations who help immigrants transition and thrive in Canada. That helps them, and that helps our country. And we're taking steps to better recognize their foreign credentials so that talented new Canadians are not perpetually underemployed when they get here, but they can get to work right away. That's going to help them get into homes.
I have a mama voice. I really don't make this. So we're going to go on to part 3 now on food security. And so another aspect of a flourishing neighborhood is that people have adequate food to eat. During COVID, we have seen the rise in need, and the government has responded. But with the hope that there will be an end to COVID, there are questions about what will happen to the aid that is so important. Here are a few questions around the issue of food security.
Caroline, who's first?
I believe it's
Peter comes first. Here we go. complete with a squash.
We're allowed to bring props.
That's wonderful. Perfect.
This is the squash I present at the food bank. Organic.
Perfect.
Island squash.
Peter, we're glad to have you here. Let me ask you this set of 3 questions. Simply, what strategy will your party take to help to deal with the crucial issue of food security?
Thank you very much. And I brought this zucchini, which is organic, that my wife and I grow on Barnston Island. We grow it for the food bank, both here and in New Westminster at St. Barnabas. We're expecting about 2 tons this year of zucchini. We've seen over the course of the last few years an increase in the number of clients coming to food banks. And so this issue of food security isn't some kind of abstract issue. This has a real impact. How do we address food security? Well, we address it by providing people with the wherewithal to actually put food on the table. And that's why the NDP is proposing a move immediately to a guaranteed livable basic income in our country, starting with people with disabilities and seniors, both of whom have had high poverty rates. We know with people with disabilities that about 50% of those who come to food banks and those who are homeless have disabilities. So we need to move immediately with a GLBI to make sure that all of those Canadians have the wherewithal to put food on the table. I am hoping that the next time there is a food bank need that is not for the kind of food insecurity that we're seeing, we can change that by providing for a GLBI. Thank you.
You can't go. I'm not going to let you away yet.
Absolutely.
All right. So here comes question number 2, and I'm trying not to laugh because the question is, what resources will your party allocate for food security? I think it meant beyond zucchinis after the announced August 4th emergency funding is done. So will there be more additional funds or?
Absolutely. But this is transition funding. As I mentioned earlier, it's when we talk about emergency shelters, when we talk about food banks, we need to transition so that nobody in this neighborhood and nobody across the country needs to go to a food bank to make ends meet. And so, yes, there will be substantial resources, but only on a transitional basis while we are building affordable housing that everybody needs. We did this after the Second World War. I'm not talking pie in the sky. The $250,000 that we will build over the next 3 years, a massive and unprecedented, with the exception of the Second World War, building of affordable housing units. And that coupled with a guaranteed livable basic income will mean that ultimately volunteers and the folks who do good work here at the food bank will no longer have to do that. They can make they can contribute to the community in other ways.
Housing costs are going up. Food prices are going up. What can we do? What will you do to ensure that those that are most vulnerable, how do we protect against the rising food costs?
We need a government that is willing to stand up for people, because it's not just food costs. We've seen the cartel and the bread prices in various parts of the country where grocery chains conspired to increase the cost of bread. We've seen telecom companies gouging people on their cell phones and on the internet. We see predatory lending, and I have a bill to address this, where low-income people are paying 400 or 500 or 600% interest. They are permanently enslaved to that predatory lender because they can never get out of that. And this is something that both the Harper government and the Trudeau government have left continue unimpeded. The NDP will shut that down. We don't believe people should be paying enormous rates because they are poor. And we'll make sure as well that the banking industry stops gouging people with all the fees and service charges that the banking industry does at the same time as they get $750 billion in liquidity supports from the government. It's offensive and it's got to stop, and the NDP will put a stop to it.
Thank you, sir. Yep. And who is the lucky second candidate? Terry's up next. All right. Terry, we're glad you're here also.
I'm glad to be here.
3 questions. You've heard them already, but here they are again. What strategies will the Liberals take to help deal with food security issues?
So in 2020, 14.6% of Canadians reported some experience of food insecurity. It's unacceptable. It also means it's a real issue. We found that there is a significant correlation, probably not surprisingly, with food insecurity and self-reporting of anxiety and poor mental health. Our government launched Canada's first anti-poverty strategy, and it actually reduced poverty to all-time lows before the start of the pandemic. This included programs like the Canada Child Benefit, improvements to the Guaranteed Income Supplement, and the Canada Workers Benefit, and affordability mechanisms like reducing the cost of childcare and reducing taxes for small businesses and the middle class. We've also created a no waste food fund, which works with organizations to eliminate food waste and to improve food security.
Thank you. Second question. What resources will your party allocate for food security after August 4th announced the emergency funding is done? So the question is, will there be additional funds available to aid community agencies, food banks, etc.? Where are we going to go with this?
So in 2019, we invested $134.4 million to create the first ever food policy for Canada and laid out 4 key principles. The first was to ensure that healthy food was available to all Canadian communities. The second was to support food security for Indigenous and Northern populations. The third was to make Canadian produced food the preference domestically and abroad. And the fourth was to decrease food waste. Since April of 2020, we've invested $300 million to address food security and supported 3,200 local food organizations. This includes the Emergency Food Security Fund, which supports food banks right across our country. And to answer your question, we are not going to let Canadians go hungry. So we'll continue to support these important programs for as long as they are needed. But the goal overall is to make sure that they're not needed.
Okay, so last question. How do we stop the rising food costs? What do we do to keep those down and protect those most vulnerable?
Yeah, so the first thing that we did when we got into office, the first thing we did was raise taxes on the wealthy so we could lower them on the middle class. We expanded the Canada Workers Benefit. So those families that were working extremely hard but for a low income were able to make ends meet. We created and expanded the Canada Child Benefit, lifting 400,000 kids out of poverty. And we've taken action on price gouging in a number of areas like cell phone and internet rates. But let me take a second to talk about the people that aren't here today, that aren't talking about this issue, and that's the Conservative Party. They'll tell you that they're going to lower your taxes by offering tax credits. You know what happens? You get a $1,000 tax credit, and you make $15,000 a year. You know how much benefit you get? Nothing. But if you make $200,000 a year, right, you'll get $430. The conservative system reduces taxes for the rich while reducing services for everyone else. And I just wanted to say, with my 3 seconds or 4 seconds left, we also have in our plan, in our platform, to reduce the criminal level of interest so that price gouging on interest rates can no longer continue.
Thanks, Terry. And number 3. We should get an automatic wiper or something here. Just
Thank you so much.
save. Yeah, absolutely. All right.
I'm a little shorter. There we go.
Perfect. You all set?
I think so, yeah.
What strategies will your party take to help deal with the food security issues we're facing?
So I've already talked a bit about the ways that we want to tackle poverty by, of course, building affordable housing, very much on board with Peter there, and also the UBI. Wonderful that you agreed to go with that one too. That's fantastic. Because this, of course, is going to give people more buying power. If you're not spending almost your entire paycheck just covering your rent, you actually have money to buy food. But there's the other side of the coin. We have to make sure that there actually is food there for people to buy. And during COVID, we saw that supply chains were getting unstable, and we know that could only get a lot worse as climate change continues. So the Green Party wants to create more land trusts nationally, like we have in BC, that are going to protect local farmland and replace 1/3 of our imports with locally grown food. And this is going to mean we're supporting research and investment in local markets and urban agriculture, and also improving food-based strategies. We are going to have to address interprovincial barriers there, but overall, these strategies could bring $15 billion back into our economy and foster a more resilient and internally supportive system.
So those are the strategies, but what about resources? So August 4th, emergency fund cut, it's done, it's over. So what's next? Are there increased funding to be able to help food banks and other things, or where do you see this going?
You know, when I was a kid, I remember when food banks showed up and we would go and volunteer there, and it was supposed to be a temporary measure. And the fact that it has continued to be this piecemeal thing is a complete travesty. Unfortunately, poverty is a policy choice. The reason we have it is because of all the years of lack of action. And while we know that by instituting UBI, that'll be a quick way to take a bite out of some of those issues, providing enough shelters and low-income housing options is going to take a little bit longer. So that's why we need long-term funding, sustained funding for all of these things to bridge that gap and to be able to respond to the needs of every community while we build the infrastructure and systems that will hopefully reduce and even end homelessness and poverty. We saw during COVID that these funds can be found when they're needed, even if too many of them ended up being diverted into big corporations. So the Green Party would make sure that instead of propping up banks and oil companies, we'd make sure we have fair taxation and those funds actually go and take care of the most needy.
Food prices over the last little while have gone up. We've seen it increasingly, all kinds of reasons, COVID being one. It costs me more money, but I have a salary. And it doesn't hurt me anywhere near as much as it hurts the vulnerable. How do we stop food prices going up so much to protect those most vulnerable?
Well, due to the climate crisis, we are going to see increasing homelessness and food insecurity in years to come. Fighting climate change absolutely has to be our first and foremost priority because it is our best tool against poverty, food insecurity, homelessness, and racism. Because as we saw with COVID, this is the sort of situation where vulnerable people are going to be the ones who get hurt the most, even though they weren't the ones responsible for causing the problems. I agree that we absolutely need to prevent profiteering and hold on to those sorts of measures, but we also one of the few parties that really work and think long-term. We're not afraid to try new things. And I really support changing systems to make communities more connected to their food supply, whether it's building urban gardens, having low-income housing get first access to these, and with adequate support for training and making sure that they can be used effectively. Creative projects like this come out of strong community partnerships. And this is why we need to make sure the locals are always involved if we want Burnaby to grow and flourish.
Thanks so much. Wonderful. Last but not least, so you've heard them, but I'll ask them again. What strategies will your party take to help deal with the food security issues we face?
Here. So we have a plan to remove interprovincial trade barriers and by reasserting the authority and leadership of the federal government on internal trade. Trade between the provinces, sometimes there are taxes that have to be paid and it limits what we get in, what can go out, and that is contributing to the cost. Carbon tax is also contributing to the cost. Anybody feeling that? Because I am. I'm just going to pull up our policy here, just one moment. So supply management is a government-imposed cartel that keeps the prices of dairy, poultry, and eggs artificially high through the control of production. That needs to change. The banning of imports, price fixing, and the prevention of competition in the market. We need to keep our market local as well as in our Canadian territory. We need to keep our own people employed and we need to keep our economy strong. And that includes helping our own farmers here in our country.
So just to push past, there's the strategies. What about the resources? What can local food banks and other organizations that are trying to deal with these food security issues, what can they expect from your party?
So we would like to create a free and open and fair system that will save Canadians money annually with lower prices that they will pay for products. We will phase out supply management system over a number of years to allow farmers to adapt and compensate them for the lost value of their quotas, and which allows the dairy, egg, and poultry farmers to thrive and sell their products internationally and locally. Can you repeat the question again? Because I want to add some more in there, please.
Yeah. So we're dealing with, will there still be additional funds available to aid community agencies, food banks to continue supplying food to households that are in need?
Okay, so we believe that revenues and taxes should be kept within the province at the municipal and local government levels in order to promote efficiency for people to obtain the help that they require at the local level.
Great stuff. Last one. Food prices going up. What are the strategies that we need to keep the prices lower so that we protect those most vulnerable?
So, I'm sorry, let me just grab my question here. So strategies would revolve around supply management, and helping low-income households is most effective dealt with at the local or provincial municipal levels. Waiting for the federal government to come up with solutions is not an avenue for obtaining a quick response. Looking at organizations around us like Quest, who provides food at a lower cost because they've taken it from stores that are selling it and it's just dated, but it's still good quality food. They have a store that you can come into where you're not on a line like a food bank, no long lines that you have to wait in. You can come in and you shop with dignity and you are respected in there. These kind of programs would be more optimal response to the need for low income households obtaining food at discount pricing. Is there another part
You
to the
did it.
question?
No, that was it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
That was it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Can we give these four a great big round of applause? Thanks. And Carol Ann, I'm going to applaud you because we aimed for an hour and we were about 30 seconds over. It was amazing how we kept straight on task. It was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
That's not us.
So, but we have one more section.
Yes, but we want to see if anybody had any questions oh, here we go. One moment. Okay. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so regarding new housing in Burnaby, most of the new housing built over the past 10 years has been market rate condos. Yes. Much of this building has been done by knocking down rental buildings, especially in the Metrotown area. This has displaced many renters who could not afford to continue renting in Burnaby. How can we stop this from happening? Not just here in Burnaby, but in communities all the way through Canada. Whoever wants to get up first. We didn't do this. Those didn't Marcella. Whoever would like to answer.
We want to agree. Peter's going to go first. We'll just go down the line and then we'll start with the next person with the next question.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, sure.
We can do that.
Yes, thank you. It's spoken in the house up before. So, once I get started, it's harder to stop me. Thank you very much. That's a very important question, right? And that was a big part of the last municipal election. And that's one of the reasons why Mike Hurley is the mayor of the city of Burnaby. It was because he took a strong stand against what are rent evictions. We're seeing New Westminster as well taking a strong stand against this. And part of the reason that the municipalities are taking action is because at the federal level, we do not yet see the measures in place that combat a lot of this dark money, including money laundering. The NDP has called for a publicly accessible beneficial ownership registry. What that means is that these cloaked corporations that buy up often these apartments throw their tenants out and then put up condos in place of them will no longer be able to hide behind a series of baffles so that we don't actually know who owns the buildings. So cities can take action, and we're seeing that in Burnaby and New Westminster, but as well, the federal government needs to put in place that publicly accessible beneficial ownership registry so that we no longer have shadow corporations throwing people out on the streets. And I pledge to continue that fight if reelected. Thank you.
Anybody else would like to speak on that?
Single mom, and I've been a renter here in Burnaby. I know how hard it is. I also know that the trusting the market to produce the kind of housing that people need is never going to happen. The market produces the kind of housing it needs, which is, it likes to have a shortage, so it can charge you a lot for the very few spots there are. That is not going to work. This is why we need to have a housing strategy that includes building housing, and we absolutely cannot allow developers to simply come in, remove rental housing without replacing it with at least as many rental units as already existed, and things that are at a similar market rate, right? We have had a CMHC that has pushed single, owning your house and ignored renters for too long. Our public housing corporation needs to actually be in charge of public housing, not just facilitating market. And that's really the strategy. I think Peter definitely expressed it better because he's done this for longer, but we need to build.
I mentioned the 30-point platform available on liberal.ca/housing. One of those planks is specifically to stop rent evictions at a federal level, so not just here in Burnaby, but right across the country. We've already started to implement a public registry, which will give us a lot of needed information so we can make smarter policy. We're going to disincentivize the financialization of housing. That means looking at the tax structure of REITs. That means looking at the tax structure of corporate owners. And we're going to create a financial crime center that is going to look at a number of financial issues, including money laundering in the housing market. But the one thing that I want to say is what I talked about earlier, the ability to put affordable units alongside market units. It's really important. I grew up in non-market housing, and I first talked to parents that were asking me, like, what do you want to do in university, when my family had never talked about university because I happened to go to school with kids whose parents were lawyers and doctors and the like. So having that integration in our community is so important. Our national housing strategy does that.
I have one general question and one that is to Peter. We have talked a lot about issues today, but the one question on everyone's mind is about COVID-19. What things will the NDP do differently than the current government? Oh, sorry, I thought I had my voice on. Okay. So Peter, we have a question that says, we have talked a lot about issues today, but the one question on everybody's mind is about COVID-19. What things would the NDP government do differently than the current government?
Thank you. Well, I'll start off by saying what we achieved during this minority parliament, because the initial government reaction, as we know, was to give out $750 billion in liquidity supports to big banks. And then they wanted to rely on employment insurance as a way of dealing with the crisis. We forced a $2,000 a month CERB benefit, emergency response benefit. We forced to put into place a rent subsidy for small businesses. The initial program was not good, and we kept pushing until a real program was put into place. We had the proposal from the Prime Minister for a 10% wage subsidy. We pushed, as other countries had done, for a 75% wage subsidy. And we pushed for benefits for seniors, people with disabilities, students, as well as a historic sick leave program for the first time in Canadian history. Those are all things that we were able to achieve in a minority parliament. So what would we do differently? We would continue the supports that need to be put into place through COVID, but more importantly, we would be looking at domestic, publicly owned vaccine manufacturing. That is something that Conservatives and Liberals gave away, and we need to ensure that in Canada we have the capacity to produce vaccines. We also would be funding the healthcare sector in a much more robust way. If I can have another minute, I would go on. But if not, I'll have to leave it there and come back and do a second half. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now what we're... yeah, sure. There we go.
So in general, on the COVID-19 pandemic response, Canada is in an enviable position. We have one of the most vaccinated countries in the world. We And we are in that position because of the tone that we set in the first 4 years. We lowered our debt to GDP ratio every single year leading up to the pandemic. We lowered our debt servicing costs as a ratio to our economy to 100-year lows. That allowed us to come through on the commitment that we made at the start of the pandemic, which was to do whatever it takes for as long as it takes to protect Canadians and businesses. We kept tens of thousands of businesses alive, stopped billions, untold billions of dollars of value being crushed, some of that value created in businesses over generations, and we helped millions of people. In my riding alone, almost 1 in 3 people have benefited from some program out of more than 100 programs that didn't even exist at the start of this pandemic. We have proven that we can be entrepreneurial, that we can be adaptable. We need to get out of this pandemic, and we need to have Canada come roaring back, and we have the best plan to make that happen. And I'm very excited to have the opportunity to try and implement it.
Oh, yes, please.
The People's Party plan is the unprecedented government response to the COVID-19 pandemic has had massively negative repercussions on Canadians' physical and mental health, economic well-being, as well as their rights and their freedoms. The standard approach to pandemic management had always been to protect the vulnerable and allow the rest of it, the healthy population, to go about their regular lives while building herd immunity. Lockdowns of entire populations were never part of any pre-pandemic planning. Governments don't want to admit that they were wrong on imposing increasingly authoritarian measures on the population, including vaccine passports. Both the vaccinated and unvaccinated will suffer under a regime of segregation, constant control, and surveillance. It is illusory to believe that the virus can be eradicated. We will have to learn to live with it without destroying our way of life in the process. So our People's Party government will promote a rational and scientifically based. Thank you.
I think overall, given that COVID-19 seemed to come out of nowhere, I was really impressed by how our different parties worked together in most cases. They came together and did the things we needed, that Canadians needed to get through this crisis. The big issue was, of course, as Peter brought up, that the planning ahead didn't happen. We should have had those vaccine facilities available before, because it's not like no one predicted that this would never, ever happen. We knew it would. And climate change is the exact same problem. We are going to end up in exactly the situation where we're kind of trying to work backwards and fix the problems that could have been avoided if we don't take strong action now. And we know, like I said before, exactly who's going to suffer the most for that. And I'm tired of seeing oil companies' profits put ahead of our lives and our health and safety.
So we are really on time. This is actually quite wonderful. Thank you. What we're going to do now is everybody is going to get a minute and for your closing remarks before we thank you and everything else. Yes. You get a full minute, or now you do, because I guess I just made that one up. So I think I went with 30 seconds originally. I think that's what I said in my email, but we'll go with a minute. What the heck?
Peter, there's no hook. No hook coming to get you.
No hook. Yeah. So Marcella. So we'll do Marcella, Maureen, Peter, and Terry. Your closing remarks.
I'm going to speak from my heart now. I grew up in foster care. I grew up in the projects downtown east side of Vancouver. I have been a single parent. I know what it is to live in poverty. I know what it is to be on welfare. I've lived that life. I also have a determination and a strength to reach into my community. I accessed a lot of food banks. I accessed pregnancy crisis help centers. I looked to the local schooling that was available to me as a single working parent. I have taken subsidized daycare. I have worked with the homeless. I have fed the homeless. I have done volunteer work within Langley, New West, Surrey, Vancouver, Seattle, and Texas. I have a heart for homelessness. I've worked with people that have been friends and are homeless. This is something that is dear to my heart, and it is an issue that I would love to step into and help in whatever way possible. I'd like to be here for the citizens of Burnaby and move this agenda forward. This is something that is precious to my heart. I know what it is to live there. Thank you.
So first off, I would like to thank everybody. First of all, obviously the organizers, not just for the work of bringing us here today, but for the work that you do every day. It is so important. And also to everyone who has tuned in, because you obviously care. You care about these same issues that I do, and you have the same heart that makes you want to help things, help people, and help make a better Canada. You believe that that's possible, just like I do. I also want to thank you for putting up with my very first debate. I've stumbled a bit, but I really appreciate all the positivity that I've gotten and the encouragement. You've given me hope that I'll be able to do a better job next time. And thankful that I've chosen to do what I am doing here. Standing up and running is a difficult decision, but I believe that this community really does deserve to have a chance for a better future. And I know that it's an amazing community, that you're all behind me, that you know that these sorts of things can happen. We can have a chance to end poverty and homelessness by working together.
I would like to say in appreciation that we are speaking on the traditional and unceded territories of the Hokamina and Squamish speaking peoples. And we thank them for the opportunity to have this gathering here tonight. I'd like to thank my colleagues, the other candidates, and of course the Burnaby Homelessness Coalition and Southside Church for this very civilized and important debate. These are fundamental issues that we have talked about tonight. And it's the start of what hopefully will be a national reflection on where we go as a country coming out of COVID. I believe we can build a society where everyone has that right to a roof over their head. We can build a society where everyone has the wherewithal to put food on the table. And we can build a society where you don't have to worry about how you pay for your healthcare or your medication or your public education. We can build a society where everybody matters and where no one is left behind. Thank you for this debate tonight, because we've been able to put out our ideas. I believe in a Canada where no one is left behind. Thank you for listening, and thanks for coming out.
We gathered tonight to talk about food security, homelessness, and housing, and we have to address the elephant in the room. The Conservative Party could send any candidate from any riding to attend this event, and they don't even have the ability to show up because they don't have answers to these problems. There is no securing our future without a housing plan. There is no securing our future without addressing homelessness, and worse, homelessness, food security, and housing are all going to be affected by climate change. And we cannot afford to go to the next round of negotiations internationally with Aaron O'Toole at the helm of Canada. The Mark Jacquard came out with a report. He's from SFU, he's an economist, on September 4th, rated the Liberal plan 8 out of 10. The Green plan 4 out of 10, the NDP plan 2 out of 10. Andrew Weaver, the Green leader and a climate scientist, has said the Liberal Party has the only feasible plan to meet our targets for the IPCC in order to fight climate change. It is the problem of our generation. We need to tackle it. the Liberal plan is the best plan. Please read up on it. Thank you for having me here tonight.
It's great. Thank you so much for taking the time, all of you, to be here tonight, to be on Zoom and on YouTube. This is being recorded, and we will be playing it often, just so you know. So on behalf of the Society to End Homelessness and Southside,
And of course, on behalf of Southside as well. Thanks, Caroline.
Southside Community Church, thank you for taking the time. We want to thank everybody who did manage to come in today, and to thank those on Zoom and YouTube. And yes, I guess we call this adjourned. Thank you. Thank you.
I put in the pictures, you put in the time.